So I have always had a very specific understanding of conspiracy theory, as there are secret conspiracies for people to knowingly control aspects of our lives. And I'll have another video about this. I spent most of my life until my late 20s trying very hard not to be a crank and not be seen as a crank. And now I'd be like, yeah, I have a lot of views that the midwit establishment types would absolutely see as crank. And I'll talk about some of those as they are relevant, but I don't feel like I need to foreground those and give them ammunition before I feel like I need to contextualize it. But I've always been, in my case, very slow to adopt views that go against the establishment narrative I was raised on, and I'll have a separate video on the whole crank thing. But an actual conspiracy theory is a whole nother level, and it's kind of qualitatively different. But what I've realized as I've started to adopt and express views that would be more crank, more fringe, more outside the mainstream, is you'll meet a lot of establishment people who'll be like, oh, yeah, you're a conspiracy theorist, where it is basically expanding the conception as just a slur for any non-mainstream ideas. And so I wanted to talk about this because I've heard and read a couple of things recently that I think do a pretty good job of distinguishing actual conspiracy theories from what is just fringe. And again, critical point of conspiracy theory is that generally you have a cabal of people who are secretly and knowingly controlling what is going on. And even then, it turns out that some of them are kind of apparently possibly true if you look at the Epstein stuff. But in general, most of the stuff that I believe that would be fringe or crank doesn't depend on conspiracy of any sort. It just depends on the groupthink of self-interested individuals. And when I make the video on crank magnetism and fringe views and stuff like that, might make a couple, I'll talk about that more. But there are at least a couple of features I've learned about conspiracy theorist mindset that I think are helpful for determining what is an actual conspiracy theory. And so one of those, and there was when some establishment YouTuber talked about this study that showed that people who believe in conspiracy theories tend to dramatically overestimate how much the rest of the population actually believes it, which could also apply to crank stuff too, but it seems to be a common denominator. And then I read this book, which is a critical theory. There's a whole series of these little critical theory books for like $10 that I've got a few and I've been reading them. And part of it is to challenge myself, what can I get out of it? Because I think a lot of what is in here is BS. And this one in particular was like referencing Jacques Lacan, who everything I've read sounds BS. And the only thing that makes me think it might not be is because Wikipedia strongly insinuates it's all BS. And whenever I agree with Wikipedia on critic of someone who is sort of outside the mainstream, I immediately start to question at this point, is it the establishment sort of driving my view of this? I think Lacan was still probably nonsense, but I'd have to actually look into that further. However, there was one point in this book that was really interesting, and it's not the main point of this book. The title, Disavowal, is basically about the phenomenon of you acknowledge, yeah, all that's true, but anyways, and just move on without addressing it. But one thing that the author of this book talked about is that conspiracy theorists, they need there to be a conspiracy. They need there to be people who are controlling the world intentionally, and there needs to be order behind the world. And my views, the ones that mainstream finds fringe, are generally the opposite of people in power are acting in self-interested, self-serving ways with no accountability. But the power they have, the effects they have, are mostly through emergent effects. Like, they're not doing this deliberately. It's groupthink of everyone agreeing with the same premises. And the way they're steering things, the consequences of their actions, are generally not where they would be intending to go. They just don't have the incentive to really care. And so I've been thinking about that because there's a lot of these terms, not just conspiracy theory. And I'm going to do at some point recorded version of my Nerd Nights talk on Quaker parrots, which is Leela's species, which so many politicians call them invasive species. And a lot of scientists who haven't looked into it also call them invasive species, but they are ecologically, definitionally not invasive. And it's political reasons that basically, if it's a non-native species, especially if it's obviously alien, then people will say, oh, it's an invasive species because we don't like it, which there are valid reasons for politicians to not like Quaker parrots. I don't think they're compelling, but I'll talk about that when I do that video. So there's a lot of terms like this. In fact, I think most terms that have a real useful technical definition, but also a strongly negative connotation, they have both the technical term, and then they have sort of a vibes-based, I don't like this view. And I am pro-vibes in certain contexts, But generally, when people in the establishment are going off of vibes to support their views, they're pretty much always wrong. People anti-establishment usually are too, but you have to defend those views more. And so people who go off vibes and then actually test them and come up with predictive answers, I think, are more likely to at least be onto something, even if it's not completely true. And so the expansion of conspiracy theory to just mean fringe is one example. Expansion of invasive species to just mean non-native species we don't like is another example. And I could probably make a list if I thought and tried to take it down, but I wanted to talk about this particular example before I make the videos on the crank stuff to draw. There is a distinction between the technical definition of a conspiracy theory, of believing in powerful people intentionally controlling the world, versus views that are outside the mainstream, fringe, and might be considered crank, which I will freely admit I am to a lot of establishment people, especially when they don't depend on intention, but actually are the reverse. It's, as I said, my position is most of the ways that the establishment, the elites, have screwed up society, it's the result of groupthink, but they're genuinely trying to do good, and they genuinely think they're doing good. They just don't have the accountability to actually react to the consequences, the negative consequences, or even admit when these policies don't do what they claim to do. And that's not just government, it's also nonprofits, academia, businesses too, at least big businesses. So anyways, wanted to talk about that quickly. A little rambly, but hope you get the point. Thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. This is Leela, and I'll see y'all on the next one.